Hello everyone. These notes go along with page 9 and 10 of your interactive notebook, and they're really to sum up Mendel's three laws. So we've kind of alluded to them, talked a little bit about them, but now we want to kind of sum them up and hopefully make some sense of them. So the first law shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. I think we all know this. When we're talking about Mendelian traits, in other words, traits that are controlled by a single gene, things like hitchhiker thumb and widow's peak and that type of stuff, certain traits are dominant over others. And since we know traits come from genes, and a variation of genes is called an allele, it should make sense that the law of dominance states that some alleles, or variations of genes, are dominant and others are recessive. So one dominant allele for a particular trait, you represent that with a capital letter when you're doing the genotype. And then recessive alleles, the only way you get these is if a dominant allele is not present. And the only way for a dominant allele to not be present is that you got both recessive allele from each of your parents, right? So the only way to get a recessive trait to show up is if you are homozygous recessive. So what does that look like? Let me show you. So remember, genotype are the letters. Phenotype, what does the organism look like? Okay, so if you got from each of your parents a capital T, and in pea plants that means tall, then you would be tall. Number one, you'd have the trait of being tall, but your genotype would be capital T, or homozygous dominant. The only way to be short in pea plants is if each of your parents gave you a recessive allele, or the lowercase t. And remember what that means is you got two genes that say you're going to be short. Now you're homozygous recessive for short. There's a little joke for you, right? Heterozygous is called a hybrid, and this is when you get two different alleles together. So see how this is. Hetero means different, so the capital T and the lowercase t are different from each other, as opposed to, let's go back here, these are homozygous. Homo means the same, right? So capital T is homozygous. Lowercase is homozygous, but then you just have to know if you're talking about dominant or recessive. Heterozygous is one of each. Okay. Mendel's second law had to do with segregation, and segregation just means to separate. He didn't really necessarily know how this happened. We do now, but he didn't know how this was happening in his pea plants. He didn't know the mechanism of it, but he understood that somehow during the formation of sex cells or gametes, the alleles for each gene segregate from each other. So the male pea plant, when it went to make its pollen, it would put one of the genes it had for height, let's say, into that gamete or into that sex cell. The other one was withheld. So remember, every pea plant got two genes, one from each of its parents, but it only passes on one of those genes to its offspring. So again, here, if you take a look, alleles for tallness and shortness. So if I have two heterozygous tall plants, right, and they're allowed to, first of all, make their pollen or eggs, right? So this, let's say, is my male plant. This is my female plant that I'm going to use, my female flower on this, and I'm going to use the pollen from this one, right? I could get either a capital T or a lowercase t from this plant's pollen. And from this one, I could have an egg that had either a capital T or a lowercase t in it. Then when the pollen and the egg from this one combine, we have these different combinations of alleles possible in their offspring. Okay, finally, Mendel's third law is that of independent assortment. And this is kind of just like it sounds like. Mendel asked himself, okay, if I have a tall plant, is it always going to have yellow flowers? Or I'm sorry, purple flowers. If I have a tall plant, will it always have purple flowers? He wanted to know if traits were linked or connected to each other. And he believed they probably would be. So a tall plant's going to always have purple flowers, and a short plant's always going to have white flowers, right? He thought these traits would be connected. But it turns out he was wrong, right? He kind of predicted incorrectly. In fact, these things assort independently from each other. So in other words, the genes for height and the genes that control flower color are not connected. They can make it into a sex cell independently of each other. And again, he didn't really know the mechanism of this. We now know that it's meiosis, right? So if we look over here, right, if we have two different traits that we're looking at, two different sets of genes, when independent assortment takes place, right, you can see all the different possible combinations that can end up in the sex cells. And then all the possible combinations of those sex cells meeting up are shown here with the offspring. Okay, so that's Mendel's three laws. We're going to work on that a little bit more. With practice, we're going to be doing these dihybrid crosses, so hopefully that makes sense. But remember, we're essentially talking about dominance and recessive. I think most people understand that. One trait seems to be dominant over another, and that's only in Mendelian traits. There's other traits we're going to talk about that's not true, but in Mendelian traits, you have dominance and recessive. You have segregation, so those traits separate from each other, and then they do so independently, right? Law of independent assortment.